The man who never calls first. There is a particular kind of silence that fills the space between two people who genuinely love each other, and it has nothing to do with love running out. It's the silence of a phone that never rings first, a text that never gets sent unprompted, a friendship that survives entirely on one person's willingness to always be the one who reaches out. And the person on the other end of that silence, the one who never calls first, is almost always a Gen X man, and almost always deeply misunderstood. He isn't cold. He isn't indifferent. He isn't, despite what it might look like from the outside, uninterested in the people he loves. But somewhere along the way, reaching out first became one of the hardest things he could be asked to do, and most people around him never quite figure out why. To understand him, the wise observer has to go back, once again, to childhood, not because everything traces back there, but because for this particular generation, so much genuinely does. The Gen X child grew up in a world where initiating contact often meant risking disappointment. A parent who was too busy, too tired, too distracted to answer, a house that was empty more often than not. A childhood where the people he most wanted attention from weren't always available to give it, no matter how much he wanted them to be. And so, without ever consciously deciding it, he learned an important lesson. Reaching out doesn't guarantee anything. Better to wait. Better to let the other person come to him, because at least then he knows the connection is real, not performed out of obligation. This is the quiet engine behind why he never calls first. It isn't laziness. It isn't a lack of caring. It's an old, deeply buried fear that if he reaches out and isn't met with enthusiasm, it will confirm something he has quietly believed about himself since childhood, that his presence is optional, that his need for connection is a burden, that wanting to be close to someone is somehow asking for too much. Consider how this plays out in his adult friendships. He may have a best friend of 30 years, someone he considers family in every way that matters, and yet months can pass without him picking up the phone. If you ask him about it, he'll shrug and say something like, "We don't need to talk every week to be close." And, in a strange way, he believes that, and it is even partly true, but underneath that, belief is something more fragile, a quiet terror that if he calls and the friend seems too busy, too distracted, too unenthusiastic, it will feel like proof that the friendship matters less to the other person than it does to him. So instead of risking that small, ordinary disappointment, he simply waits. He tells himself he's respecting the other person's time. What he's really doing is protecting himself from a wound that goes back decades. The wise observer wants to be very clear here. This isn't about blame. This is about understanding a pattern so common in this generation that it deserves to be named plainly and treated with compassion rather than frustration. Because the people who love him, his wife, his adult children, his old friends, often interpret his silence as disinterest, when in reality, it is almost the opposite. He thinks about them constantly. He simply never learned that thinking about someone and reaching out to them were supposed to be the same action. There's a particular kind of loneliness embedded in this pattern that rarely gets discussed. He often ends up surrounded by relationships that are technically intact, but functionally one-sided in terms of initiation. His wife plans the outings. His children call to check in. His friends are the ones who suggest getting together. And slowly, over years, he can start to feel like a passenger in his own social life, watching everyone else steer the ship while he sits quietly in the passenger seat, wondering why he never learned to take the wheel without realizing that the wheel was always there. He simply never trusted that anyone wanted him driving. This pattern often intensifies after a major life transition, retirement, an empty nest, the loss of a job that used to provide built-in social contact. Suddenly, the structures that used to initiate connection for him disappear, and he's left facing the uncomfortable reality that if he wants relationships to continue, he may actually have to be the one to start them. For many Gen X men, this moment arrives quietly and painfully in their 50s and 60s, a slow, dawning realization that the phone hasn't rung in weeks, and it hasn't occurred to him, not once, that he could simply be the one to make it ring. It's worth examining, too, how this shows up specifically with his own adult children. He loves them fiercely, but he often waits for them to call, sometimes for weeks, telling himself he doesn't want to be that parent who calls too much, who seems needy, who intrudes on their busy adult lives. What he doesn't realize is that his children are often waiting too, wondering why their father never reaches out, interpreting his silence the exact same way his own friends do as evidence of lower investment, rather than what it actually is, an old fear of being the one who wants connection more than it's wanted back. There's an important nuance here that the wise observer wants to highlight. This isn't simply shyness, and it isn't simply introversion. Plenty of introverted people call first without a second thought. This is something more specific, a deeply held belief, formed early and reinforced over decades, that initiating contact is inherently risky, that the safest emotional position is always to be the one responding rather than the one reaching. It's a subtle but crucial distinction, and understanding it changes everything about how to approach him. Consider, too, how this pattern shows up in romantic relationships, particularly in the early stages before a relationship has fully solidified. He may have missed out on connections entirely in his younger years simply because he waited for the other person to make the first move, again and again, convincing himself that if she was interested, she would reach out. Meanwhile, someone equally interested, but operating under the same unspoken rule, was doing exactly the same thing on her end, and two people who genuinely wanted each other quietly let the opportunity dissolve into nothing. Both waiting for a signal, the other was too afraid to send first. Even within marriages, this pattern doesn't fully disappear. His wife may be the one who always suggests date night, who always initiates difficult conversations, who always asks the first question when something feels off between them. He isn't avoiding these moments out of a lack of investment in the relationship. He's simply waiting, the way he's always waited, for someone else to open the door first, because opening it himself still carries that old, quiet risk of being met with silence. The wise observer wants to point out something important about how this pattern intersects with his professional life, too. He is often the employee who never asks for a raise, never reaches out to a mentor for advice, never initiates the difficult conversation about wanting a promotion, not because he lacks ambition, but because asking directly for something feels dangerously close to that same old vulnerability. Waiting to be noticed, waiting to be offered, waiting to be asked, these feel safer to him than the exposure of reaching out and being told no. There is, underneath all of this, a genuine and touching irony. The man who never calls first is very often one of the most loyal, most steady, most deeply committed people in the lives of everyone around him. He simply expresses that loyalty through constancy rather than initiation, by always answering when called, by always showing up when asked, by never once wavering in his presence once someone else has opened the door. His love isn't absent. It's structured entirely around response rather than pursuit. And once someone understands that distinction, his behavior stops looking like distance and starts looking like a very specific, very old kind of devotion. It's worth naming, too, the quiet grief that can build in him as he gets older and notices, sometimes with real pain, how many relationships have simply faded not through conflict, not through any falling out, but through the slow erosion that happens when neither person consistently reaches out. He may look back at friendships from decades ago and feel a genuine ache about losing touch, without ever quite connecting that ache to his own decades-long pattern of waiting rather than reaching. This isn't a character flaw. It's an old wound doing exactly what old wounds do, quietly shaping decisions long after the original pain has been forgotten. There's something worth saying about how this pattern shows up during hard times specifically. When something difficult happens to him, a health scare, a job loss, a personal struggle, he becomes even less likely to reach out for support, precisely when he needs it most. The same old fear intensifies under stress. What if he calls and the person doesn't have time, doesn't have space, doesn't prioritize him the way he would prioritize them? So he goes quiet exactly when connection would help him most, and the people who love him are often left wondering, sometimes for years, why he never told them how hard things really were. There's a particular scene worth picturing, because it captures the pattern more honestly than any explanation could. Picture him sitting in his kitchen on a quiet Sunday afternoon, phone resting on the table in front of him, an old friend's name sitting in his contacts, untouched for months. He thinks about calling. He genuinely wants to. His thumb hovers near the screen. And then some old, quiet voice tells him it's probably a bad time, that the friend is probably busy, that he shouldn't intrude, and the phone goes back in his pocket, the thought unacted upon. The connection quietly postponed for another day that may or may not come. This hesitation rarely looks dramatic from the outside. It isn't anguish. It's small, almost invisible, a flicker of intention followed by a quiet retreat, repeated so many times over so many years that it eventually stops registering as a choice at all. It simply becomes who he is, the guy who's easy to reach but never reaches out. It's worth understanding, too, how differently he treats scheduled contact versus spontaneous contact. He'll show up, without fail, to a standing weekly card game, a scheduled family dinner, an annual fishing trip planned months in advance. Structure removes the risk for him. There's no ambiguity about whether he's wanted, because the invitation already exists, built into the calendar rather than requiring him to generate it himself. It's the unscheduled, spontaneous reach, the impulsive, thinking of you text, the surprise phone call that remains almost impossibly difficult, because spontaneous contact requires him to generate the invitation from nothing, with no prior confirmation that it will be welcomed. This explains, too, why he often thrives inside group settings that already have built-in structure: a men's breakfast club, a recurring golf outing, a family group chat someone else maintains, while struggling enormously with one-on-one contact that depends entirely on his own initiation. The structure does the emotional labor that he was never quite able to do for himself, and he can show up fully present and engaged, precisely because showing up was never a decision he had to make alone. There is also a specific pattern worth noting in how he responds once someone else does reach out to him. He often over-delivers in response to being contacted, showing up early, staying late, going out of his way to be useful and present, almost as if trying to make up, through effort, for the initiation he didn't provide. It's a quiet form of guilt, expressed through generosity rather than words. If he can't be the one who calls first, he can at least be the one who gives the most once someone else has opened the door. The wise observer also wants to gently note how this pattern can quietly shape a man's sense of his own worth over time. When years pass without him initiating contact, and yet very few new invitations arrive to replace the ones that faded, he can begin to internalize a painful and inaccurate conclusion: that he simply isn't someone people think to include. He rarely considers the more accurate explanation that most relationships require initiation from both sides to survive, and that his own long silence played an equal role in the quiet fading he now mistakes for evidence of being forgettable. Many men from this generation, especially later in life, begin to notice the pattern themselves, often prompted by a missed opportunity, a friend who passed away before he ever made that overdue call, a moment of genuine regret that finally outweighs the old fear. Change, when it comes, tends to be small and quiet, much like everything else about him. A single phone call made on impulse, a text sent before he can talk himself out of it, a small, brave act of reaching first that feels to him disproportionately enormous. The wise observer's closing thought is this: if you love a man who never calls first, understand that his silence was never a measurement of how much he cares. It was a measurement of how much it costs him, internally, to risk reaching out and not being met the way he hopes to be. The bravest thing he can do, in his own quiet way, is not the grand gesture, it's the small, ordinary act of picking up the phone first, unprompted, simply because he wanted to hear your voice. And when he finally does, it deserves to be recognized for exactly what it is. Not a small thing at all, but one of the most vulnerable things a man like him will ever do.